Welcome to SchiZophia. I'm Calm, a fractured mind exploring philosophy, science, mythology, mysticism, psychology, and consciousness. Let's begin. Whimsy is a word that lost track of its own origin story and decided that was the whole point. Nobody can tell you where it came from. Etymologists shrug at it. The best guess is a Scandinavian root, an Old Norse word meaning to let the eyes wander, or a Norwegian word meaning to flutter. But nobody will stake their reputation on it. It might just be an arbitrary coinage, the same class of word as flim-flam or jim-jam, invented by someone who needed a sound that felt right and didn't bother with a lineage. Whimsy apparently has always refused to explain itself, which is fitting, because that's exactly what whimsy does. It's serious about not being serious. It's the only kind of nonsense that knows exactly what it's doing. Logic wearing a different coat, one with more interesting pockets. And people tend to confuse it with things it isn't. Whimsy isn't chaos. Chaos has no internal coherence, no thread running through it, no sense that it knows where it's going even if you don't. Whimsy has its own strange consistency. Follow it long enough and you start to see the shape of it. It isn't silliness either. Silliness wants to be dismissed, wants the permission of not being taken seriously. Whimsy doesn't ask for permission, and it isn't escapism. Escapism runs from reality, puts as much distance as possible between itself and the difficult thing. Whimsy doesn't run. It stays in the room, looks the difficult thing directly in the eye, and then does something completely unexpected with it. That last distinction is the one that matters for everything that follows in this video. Because what I want to talk about today isn't whimsy as an aesthetic, not the quirky wallpaper choice or the unexpected sock pattern, though there's nothing wrong with either of those. I want to talk about whimsy as a method, a way of moving through a life that doesn't always make sense, in a reality that turns out to be considerably stranger than advertised without losing either your footing or your sense of humor about the whole thing. I want to talk about it because I had to learn it the hard way. And the hard way in my case was a rope. A very real one, stretched between two states of mind that had no business being as close together as they were. On one side, the world everyone else was living in. On the other, a war nobody else could see. The only way I found to walk that rope without falling was to decide the fall wasn't the only thing the rope was for. I was a serious person before my illness. That's the part people don't expect. Not reckless, not already strange at the edges, not someone who was always going to end up somewhere unusual. Serious, grounded, or so I thought. The kind of person who approaches things carefully, who takes ideas seriously, who doesn't leave loose ends. That was my baseline. That was who I was before the paranoia came. And when it came fully formed. Crooked magicians, jinns, a setup so elaborate I couldn't see all the edges of it. Betrayal stacked on betrayal everywhere I looked. Signals hidden in ordinary things, a conspiracy with me at the center of it that I hadn't asked to be part of and couldn't find my way out of. The architecture of it was intricate. It had its own internal logic, its own rules, its own cast of characters. And every single one of them was after me. None of it was safe. I was at war, even if I was the only one who knew it. On the outside, I stayed quiet, harmless. Nobody around me had to carry what I was carrying. The weight of it, the vigilance it required, the sheer exhausting work of tracking an enemy that kept shifting shape. I kept that completely interior. To anyone watching, I was just a quiet young man going about his life. Inside, I was fighting for it, and I never backed down, not once. I want to be careful here because this is the part that's easiest to misread. I'm not telling you the war was good. I'm not telling you psychosis is a journey worth taking or that there was a gift waiting inside it that made it worthwhile. There wasn't a gift. There was a war. A real one, with real costs. fought entirely inside the most private space a person has. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and I'm not recommending the method. What I'm telling you is what actually happened, which is a different thing. What actually happened is that somewhere in the middle of that war, something shifted. The siege didn't lift. The paranoia didn't just decide to be reasonable one day and stand down. But the relationship to it changed. The war became something else. A game, a cosmic one, vast and strange, with rules that were stranger than the war's rules had been, but rules I could work with. The enemy stopped being something to defeat and started being something to outmaneuver. And the figure doing the outmaneuvering, the one who was going to survive this not by being stronger, but by being quicker, wittier, more unpredictable than anything the game could throw at him. That figure had a personality, a distinct one. He was a trickster. And the game built him in ways I never could have built myself deliberately, surviving a war nobody else could see without losing the thread of who I actually was. That does something to a person, not a gift. Just proof now baked permanently into me that I've already faced the worst version of my own mind, and I'm still standing on the other side of it. That's a particular kind of self-trust. It doesn't come from succeeding at things or being told you're capable. It comes from the war, and there's no shortcut to it that skips the war. There's one more thing the illness gave me that the clinical literature would call a symptom. Disorganized speech. That's the term. Unusual associations between words. Language that moves by sound and feel and resonance rather than strict logical sequence. The kind of thinking that pulls words toward each other for reasons that don't follow the standard rules. A fractured way of making meaning if you're reading the diagnostic manual. If you're living inside it, it feels like something else entirely, and it felt like spellcraft, words behaving like they have weight, like they pull toward each other by a kind of gravity, like the right arrangement of them can do something to the air in a room. I didn't choose that, but I kept it, and that's how I ended up with two distinct people living in the same body. The one you'd meet, composed, measured, unremarkable on the surface, and underneath, a magician who weaves stories out of language like spells, a trickster who turns every trap into a game, a fighter who never backs down. He has a name, Khan, the same figure who stood as the witness in the first video on this channel, the one who watches what's been woven and tells its story, the one who doesn't weave but sees the whole of what the weaving made. I didn't reach for that character because it seemed poetic. I didn't construct him to fit a mythology. Khan is the name I was born with. The trickster who got me through the war and the character I built into the channel's first myth are the same person. I didn't know that when I started. I'm not sure it would have surprised me if I had. I know what it feels like to have your grip on reality come loose. I know the specific texture of it, the way ordinary things start to mean too much. The way the edges of the world stop being where you put them. The way the ground under your thinking shifts, and you can't find the stable place to stand that you were certain was there a moment ago. I lived inside that feeling for months. I fought a war inside it. So when I tell you that reality is considerably wonkier than it looks for everyone, not just for me, not just for people whose minds have fractured and rebuilt themselves, I'm not being provocative. I'm not trying to win an argument or make anyone feel better about losing their footing. I'm telling you something I've had to think about seriously, because it turned out to matter for how I survived. And the science, it turns out, is on my side, not as proof of anything mystical, not as a confirmation that the war I fought was literally real in the way it felt real, but as evidence that the solid ground the rest of the world was standing on while I was fighting my invisible war was never quite as solid as it looked from the outside. Start with perception, with the basic machinery of how any mind, fractured or otherwise, makes contact with the world. Your brain is not a window. It doesn't open up and let reality in. It's a prediction machine, constantly actively generating a model of what it expects the world to be, and then adjusting that model when the incoming signals don't match. What you experience as seeing, hearing, feeling the ground under your feet, that's not raw reality arriving unfiltered. That's your brain's best current guess, rendered so seamlessly that it feels like the thing itself. The neuroscientist Anil Seth puts it like this: we are all hallucinating all the time. The difference between what we call reality and what we call a hallucination isn't that one is real and the other isn't. It's that the hallucination we call reality is one enough people happen to be having simultaneously that we stopped noticing we were having it at all. Mine just didn't get enough votes. That's not an insult to anyone's sanity, including mine. It's just the truth sitting underneath all of our experiences equally, the thing the machinery is doing whether you can see it or not. Perception was never built to hand you the truth. It was built to keep your ancestors fed and alive long enough to have children. The truth was never the point. Survival was the point. And what survives is the hallucination that works, not necessarily the one that's accurate. That's just the brains. Physics gets stranger still. Particles entangled with each other across any distance behave as though something passes between them instantly. Faster than any signal could travel, faster than light, with nothing visible connecting them. Measure one, and its partner responds as though it already knew. That's not a fringe claim. That's an experimentally verified fact that earned a Nobel Prize in 2022. The universe, at its most fundamental level, does not respect the kind of locality, the neat separation between here and there, now and then, that common sense insists on. Push deeper into the foundations of quantum mechanics, and you find experiments that, under certain interpretations, look almost retro-causal, as though a measurement made now reaches backward and shapes what was already recorded. Most physicists will tell you there's a more conservative explanation, and they're probably right to be careful. But the fact that they have to work this hard to keep reality boring says something worth hearing. The argument isn't settled, the ground isn't solid. Everyone in the room is working with a partial picture, including the people whose partial picture has the most votes. So here's where I want to land, because this isn't a lecture on physics or neuroscience, and I'm not trying to leave you feeling like the floor has dropped out from under everything. What I want to say is simpler than that. If nobody, and not the neuroscientist, not the physicist, not the careful person who has never once had their grip on reality slip, if nobody is actually standing on ground as solid as it feels, then the question isn't who has reality figured out and who doesn't. Nobody has it fully figured out. The question is what you do with that. And what I found in the middle of a war that the rest of the world couldn't see is that the kindest and most honest thing you can do with a reality this contested, this genuinely strange, this much more uncertain than it pretends to be, is stop trying to hold it perfectly still. Weave a story around it instead. Treat the uncertainty as a game you get to play, not a trap you have to escape. That's not giving up on reality. It's not retreating into fantasy or pretending the hard things aren't hard. It's admitting that we were always building the floor as we walked, every one of us, and that the only real choice we ever had was whether to build it on purpose. Every culture that has ever had to stare down chaos, and that is every culture, without exception, eventually invented the same figure. Not a hero. Heroes win by being stronger than the thing they're fighting, by meeting force with greater force, by enduring what the enemy throws at them until the enemy runs out of things to throw. The hero's method is direct. It requires the kind of courage that knows what it's up against and walks toward it anyway. The trickster wins differently. The trickster doesn't meet the trap head-on. The trickster changes what the trap is for. And the fact that this figure shows up independently in cultures that never had contact with each other, that the same basic architecture of character appears in the Sufi teaching stories of medieval Anatolia and the sacred myths of the Yoruba people of West Africa and the creation narratives of the indigenous nations of the American Southwest. That's not a coincidence worth dismissing. That's a signal. Humanity kept building this tool because humanity kept needing it. Let me show you 3 versions of the same tool. There's a Sufi figure I grew up hearing about, Mulla Nasruddin, the wise fool of the Islamic world whose stories have been circulating for somewhere around 8 centuries and show no signs of wearing out. One Friday, Nasruddin is asked to preach at the mosque without any preparation. He climbs into the pulpit, looks out at the congregation, and asks, "Do you know what I'm about to say?" They say no. Then there is no point speaking to people who don't already know, he says, and climbs back down and leaves. The following Friday, embarrassed, the congregation decides to be ready for him. When he asks the same question, they say yes, they know. "Then there is nothing left for me to tell you," he says, and leaves again. The third Friday, they devise a strategy. Half the congregation will say yes, half will say no. When he asks the question and gets both answers, Nasruddin nods. "Then let the half who know tell the half who don't," he says, and walks out a third time. He never once answers the question they keep asking. He just keeps moving the ground it was standing on. Every trap the congregation sets for him becomes a different trap by the time he's done with it. And each time, without ever being unkind, without ever being cruel, he leaves them holding something they have to think about for the rest of the week. That's the move, not the answer, the reframe. Eshu is the Yoruba god of the crossroads, the figure you have to address before you address any other god, because he controls the boundary between one thing and the next, between the question and the answer, between the world as it is and the world as it could be. One day, Eshu walks the path between 2 farms owned by lifelong friends. He is wearing a hat. On one side, the hat is red. On the other side, it is black. Each farmer sees only the half of the hat facing him. They meet at the end of the day and begin to talk about the stranger who passed by. The first says, "Did you see the man in the red hat?" The second says his hat was black. The first says he is certain. The second says the first must be blind or lying. They argue. Then they fight. 2 lifelong friends over a hat, each one absolutely certain the other has lost his mind or his honesty. Until someone points out that neither of them was ever looking at the same half of the same hat. Nobody lied. Nobody was confused. They each had an honest, partial slice of something neither of them could see whole. And Eshu, who made the hat, who walked that particular path between those particular farms, who knew exactly what he was doing, is not in the story to be blamed for the fight. He's in the story to show you the fight was always going to happen, and to show you why. This is what reality looks like from the crossroads. Everyone is telling the truth about their half of the hat. Nobody has the whole hat. The wisdom isn't in figuring out whose half is right. The wisdom is in remembering there was a hat at all. And then there is Coyote. In the traditions of the Navajo and neighboring peoples of the American Southwest, Coyote is present at the creation of the night sky. A more careful deity is arranging the stars, placing them one at a time into the darkness with deliberate hands, building the constellations in precise and considered order. Each one in its proper place, the whole thing unfolding according to a plan. Coyote watches for a while. Coyote gets impatient. He grabs the blanket on which the remaining stars are laid out, gathers it up and flings it. All at once, no order, no plan, no consideration for the careful work that was already underway. Stars scatter across the whole of the sky in every direction. That is how the Milky Way is made. Not the careful version. The impatient did it wrong through the whole blanket version. The myth does not punish Coyote for ruining the plan. It does not treat the scattered stars as a mistake that someone will eventually have to fix. It quietly, without ceremony, credits him with the most beautiful thing in the sky. The mess was the material. The deviation from the plan was the plan. 2 trickster gods and a wise fool. 3 continents, 3 traditions, none of them sharing a story. All 3 building the same tool, Nasruddin, Eshu, Coyote. The reframe, the partial view, the mess that becomes the sky. Because it's a tool humanity already trusted enough to put into its oldest stories. Trusted enough to keep rebuilding across every sea and every century, every time the ground got uncertain enough that the hero's method stopped being enough on its own. Which means when my own mind built Ka'an, in the middle of a war I didn't ask for, out of materials I wouldn't have chosen. I didn't invent anything. I just found out the hard way that the tool actually works. So here's how to use it. Not as a philosophy to admire from a distance. Not as a collection of interesting stories about interesting figures from interesting traditions. As a tool, the same one Nasruddin and Eshu and Coyote and Khan were all carrying. The one humanity kept rebuilding every time the ground got uncertain enough that straight lines and solid answers stopped being sufficient. 4 moves, that's all it is. The first move is this: nobody gets the whole hat. Not the scientist, not the philosopher, not the person whose grip on reality has never once slipped. Not me, in the middle of my worst year. Everyone is standing at their own angle, seeing their own half of something that is larger than any one position can contain. That's not a failure of intelligence or attention, it's the structure of the situation. It was always going to be this way. The reason this is a move and not just a depressing observation is what it does to the panic. Most of the suffering that comes from uncertainty, from the feeling that the ground is shifting, that your picture of reality isn't holding together the way it should, comes from the assumption that there is a complete picture somewhere and you're failing to reach it. That someone else has the whole hat and you've been given a defective piece. Once you actually accept that nobody has the whole hat, that the partiality is universal and not personal, the panic has nowhere left to go. You're not behind, you're not broken, you're just at a crossroads like everyone else, seeing what can be seen from where you're standing. That's where you start. Not with answers, with the honest admission that partial is all anyone ever gets. The second move: when reality traps you, don't fight the trap on its own terms. Change what the trap is for. This is Nasruddin's move, the one he makes 3 Fridays in a row without ever raising his voice or arguing with anyone. The congregation keeps setting a trap. He keeps declining to be in it. Not by escaping, not by dismantling it, but by stepping to one side and finding out what else the trap can be used for. When the paranoid war was at its worst, fighting it on its own terms would have meant accepting the logic of the war. Enemies, betrayal, a siege that had to be won or lost. Trying to disprove the hallucinations, trying to argue my own mind out of the architecture it had built. That's the trap on its own terms. The move that actually worked was changing what the war was for. The same cast of characters, the same intensity, the same never backing down. But now it's a game. Now the trickster is in charge. The facts of the experience didn't change. The story I was telling about them did. That's available to you without a crisis. Every situation that feels like a trap has a frame around it that you didn't choose and aren't required to keep. The frame is not the situation. You can change the frame. The third move: the mess is allowed to be the material. Coyote doesn't clean up the scattered stars. The myth doesn't end with someone carefully putting them back in order. The Milky Way exists because the mess was left as the mess, and it turned out the mess was the most beautiful thing in the sky. My disorganized speech was a diagnostic symptom. It was also the thing that made me a magician of words. Those two facts are both true at the same time, and the second one did not require resolving the first one. The spellcraft didn't come after the illness was managed. It came from inside the illness, made of exactly the material the illness provided, assembled into something that works precisely because it didn't follow the careful plan. Whatever in your life looks like a deviation from the plan, whatever is broken by the rules of the careful version, whatever scattered your stars before you were ready, that material is still material. You don't have to fix it before you can use it. You can build with it now exactly as it is. The deviation might be the plan. The fourth move, and this is the one that ties everything together, is this. Build your trickster on purpose. I didn't get to choose mine. Khan arrived uninvited in a war I didn't ask for, built out of materials I wouldn't have selected. But once he was there was a choice that nobody else could make for me. I could treat him as a symptom, something to be managed, reduced, eventually eliminated as the illness came under control. Or I could use him, keep the magician, keep the spellcraft, keep the figure who turns traps into games and wars into myths and disorganized speech, into the language of a channel about consciousness and reality and the strange, beautiful mess of being alive. I used him, and that choice, not the war, not the illness, not the crisis that built him, that choice is available to you without any of the conditions I went through to get there. You don't need a war to find your trickster. You just need to look honestly at whatever wonky, contradictory, doesn't fit the careful plan thing is already true about your life and decide what you're going to do with it. Treat it as a problem to be solved, a deficiency to be corrected, a deviation to be apologized for. Or pick it up, turn it over, find out what it's actually for. That's the whole offer, not a promise that the rope gets easier to walk, not a guarantee that the fall isn't real. Just the one thing I know from having walked it, that the fall isn't the only thing the rope is for. And somewhere on the other side of that decision, if you keep walking, there's a trickster waiting with your name on him, and a myth that was always going to need you to tell it. And that's where we'll rest for today. Thank you for spending this time here. Genuinely. This channel is my way of building something real, on my own terms. If something here resonated with you, if it made you think or see something differently, pass it on. Share it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.